Hello, everyone, and welcome to the C2MCI's EDII Catalyst podcast. For new listeners turning in, I'm your guest host, Mark Aloisio, and in this podcast series, we will explore topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity in STEM, featuring guest speakers from diverse backgrounds and perspectives discussing their lived experiences, as well as provide resources and tips on how to create more inclusive and equitable environments. Through this, we hope to inspire you to become a catalyst for change in your own communities and workplaces.
Today on the podcast is going to be Dr. Kim Hellemans. She is from Carleton University. She is an award-winning educator, a neuroscientist, and the Associate Dean of Science at Carleton University. She's recognized for her passion for teaching. She's earned prestigious awards, the OCUFA Provincial Teaching Award for note. Most of her research focuses on the intersection between mental health, substance use, and academic outcomes, with some recent work exploring problematic cannabis use as well as problematic social media use, graduate student mental health, and the experiences of both gender and sexual minority students in higher education. She is a champion of knowledge transfer. She has very widely viewed neuroscience animations on substance use and stigma. She also hosts an award-winning podcast called Minding the Brain, where she brings cutting-edge neuroscience to the public. And my favorite Kim Hellman story is that she's actually gone on the Severance podcast and met and talked about some of the wondrous ideas behind the brain that might detail or talk about in the world of Severance. So everyone say welcome to Kim. Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. I was just going to say, it's my fun fact that I have met Ben Stiller.
I feel like you have met him. You were on a pod. It was like an hour long.
Yeah,
Quite a bit of time with Ben. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I'll try and keep it short so that we can have some audience time and audience questions later. But the first question I wanted to start off with is about misconceptions. So, Kim, you have been researching cannabis for, I believe it was 9 years that you told me. What is one misconception or many misconceptions about cannabis use that you would like to correct before we even get started with all of our other questions?
So I would say this misconception still persists, but it is one that I have sort of tried to combat since I started studying cannabis, and that was around legalization, pre-legalization, and that is that cannabis is not addictive. So prior to legalization, I've been teaching about cannabis for years now, 15, 20 years, and I've often had students in my class that have pushed back on whether cannabis is addictive. And you definitely would hear that in certain social media platforms, YouTube, Reddit, people saying it's just a harmless herb. It has medicinal properties. It can cure cancer, and therefore it's not addictive. And I'm here to say it is absolutely addictive, which means that it does have a potential so that people who, it's not all people, but certain people who have certain risk factors may inevitably develop what's called a cannabis use disorder, which is the diagnostic term for a cannabis addiction. And related to that, another misconception is that cannabis addiction looks the same in everyone. And that relates to sort of our stereotyped or stigmatized images about addiction in general. But I want to emphasize that somebody who might be in struggle or might be struggling to maintain their use and their behavior and maintain health around cannabis use, that can look quite differently across different populations of people. So it's important, if, we're going to get into this later, if you see somebody that you're concerned about that might be using cannabis more frequently, or starting to skip school or not hand in things or not show up to things, these can be sort of pink flags around their cannabis use behaviors. But it's a not one size fits all approach to what cannabis addiction is.
Thank you. And I really like the use of the word pink flag. I haven't used or heard of that term before. It's quite good. So leading from your question here, what impacts does cannabis use have on student populations in particular?
Yeah, so students, of which they are young adults, right? So they're around 18 to 29, particularly we include graduate students in this population. They are the demographic in Canada that uses cannabis the most. So when we look at nationally representative data sets, we ask people, did you use cannabis in the last year? About a third, 38%, a peak of young adults say yes, that they've used cannabis in the last year. So it's a pretty high proportion of folks. And then of that, when we look at young adults and then we nest students, are you in post-secondary education? Students are also more likely to use cannabis than non-students. So we have a population that's using cannabis quite a bit. And again, I want to emphasize that we're looking at cannabis use across a spectrum. And I want to emphasize that we look at it from what I would say is the substance use health spectrum, from anybody who's not using or might have used in the past and is currently not using, to people who might be using cannabis occasionally, to those that might be using more regularly and noticing some impact on their health, to people who at the other end of the spectrum, they're no longer able to maintain their health goals. And among our student populations, we've got everybody in there, right? We've got people who don't use, abstain from using, that are using for recreational purposes. So they might be using to relax, to get high, to get in touch with their emotions, to be creative. And that frequency range could differ as well. So that's what we would say is low frequency social or recreational use that doesn't necessarily map onto problems or puts you at risk for a cannabis use disorder. That said, we do have a fair proportion of students who are using daily or near daily, so 20 to 30 days a month, that also would, I'd say, are showing some more higher risk behaviors around their cannabis use. And what's interesting is when we ask students, do you use cannabis? We get this, you all can think about as a normal distribution, right? We get a normal distribution with alcohol. So we've got some small tail ends of never used and use a lot. With cannabis, we get this, what's called a hockey stick shaped distribution. So we've got several that I don't use. I use about once a month. I use about once a week. I use daily. We get this blip. That's the hockey stick, right? So we actually have about 20% of our students that are using daily or near daily. And this is something where we need to kind of have a little bit of a close eye on as to why are they using so much? What is the impact on their health? And then what you asked is, what is the impact on student populations? Well, what we know is students that are using daily or near daily may be less likely to be able to keep up with their academics, right? They may not be showing up to class. There's a lot of research that shows they're a high risk for dropping out of university because they're using and they're not able to keep up with their schoolwork, and invariably that's going to lead to lower educational attainment. So I would say cannabis is often used as a coping tool that works until it doesn't anymore. And that's, where we need to kind of have opportunities to intervene or to have conversations with young adults or students. And reaching them is very, very hard. And that is sort of the impetus behind a lot of the research that I do, is how do we reach populations of people who may be using cannabis, may not be doing so well, are not able to maintain their health goals, and are also not able to attain their educational goals. How can we have conversations with them and bridge that gap?
That is really, really quite insightful. Thank you for that. I didn't know that it had such a sharp hockey stick style of curve there.
Yeah.
One of the things we had talked about a little bit in the pre-interview was that a lot of these studies are quite focused on undergraduate populations because they're more attainable for, collecting data, for interviewing. Do you anticipate any large differences between, graduate or even say like postdoctoral populations versus our more, undergrad populations? What differences do you expect there to be?
Yeah, I love these questions because I do think graduate students often get lost in universities' care and support. And there's a lot of systems in place to support undergraduate student well-being, and graduate students historically, they don't have as many support systems in place and resources available to them. And importantly, they face very unique stressors relative to our undergraduate students. So already, first of all, I want to emphasize that graduate students are a unique population because they have been self-selected to some extent based on their persistence. right? It's not just about how smart you are, how well you do in school. Graduate success is based on your grit, your resilience, and your persistence in spite of failure, right? And we see failure a lot as graduate students, as in academics, and it's being able to kind of go, okay, that didn't work. Now what, right? Like, and just getting yourself back up on the horse over and over again. And they face often more chronic, unstructured stress and isolation, which is common in graduate school. It is, it can be a very, very lonely place. And that's why I always say, pick your lab really well, pick your mentor really well, because when you create community in your graduate school, it does so much to buffer against the ill effects of those stressors, which are, again, persistent, unpredictable. And so you need pretty good coping skills to enter graduate school. So already we're in a bit of a different place in terms of, you might not have less stress, but you're able to handle and manage stress better. But then I want to add the layer of the accountability to your supervisor. There's different power dynamics. Like what I always say, because we're trying to shape and support the mental health framework here at Carleton, is, when you've got an undergraduate student in distress, there's a very clear pathway of finding support for them. When you have a graduate student in distress and a graduate student who might be struggling, it's a very different pathway, because that person is still has expectations within your research group, or in, they're going to be working with you for 2 years, 5 years. So it's not like you can hand it off, somebody else seeks support, and then they continue in your course or not. Very different situation with a graduate student, and it necessitates, I would argue, we need more training of graduate supervisors. We need to continually train and engage with them on how to support a graduate student who's not doing well, and what does that look like? And a reminder that we're not therapists, we're not psychologists, but there are certainly things that we can do to support a student who's not doing well. So I would say, when back to the question about anticipating a different population, I would say they're still at risk. They're still going to be using substances as a means to cope. Alcohol is pervasive in a lot of our culture, in academia as well as conferences. Cannabis is kind of coming into that space now. We're starting to see a little bit of a replacement of cannabis from alcohol. And so I'm curious to see where the research will go in terms of understanding the complexity of that substance use, coping, stress, mental health, and well-being of graduate students.
Fantastic. I'm quite interested in this replacement between alcohol with cannabis use. I know that we talked about it a little bit before, but do you see any benefits from that from a harm reduction point of view? Alcohol, as you mentioned, is deeply embedded in academic culture. So it'd be interesting to know what kind of health benefits there are, or health changes, I guess might be a better way of phrasing it, when we see people move from alcohol use to cannabis use.
For sure. And I do think that's an important conversation to have, is to look at it from a harm reduction lens, to acknowledge that substance use is not inherently bad. Substances are not bad. People who use substances are not bad people. We have been using substances throughout millennia for various different reasons, religious, spiritual, to enjoy a meal together. There are definitely a range of harms associated with substance use, and more use, more harms is another thing that we tend to say in the substance use field. But certainly I would say cannabis has, the harm landscape is quite different than with alcohol. So alcohol, we know increasingly there's now dialogue around the fact that it is carcinogenic. And people who use a lot of alcohol very regularly, coupled with other lifestyle factors and genetics, are at high risk for certain cancers. We haven't been able to study cannabis for as long because of the legal framework. So I want to put that caveat out there. But certainly one example of a harm reduction piece is, I hear from young women, as an example, that when they're out at the bar, they're at a higher risk for their drinks being tampered with, and therefore higher risk for sexual assault. And so there's been a conscientious choice to not consume alcoholic beverages out in public or out when they're in amongst people that they don't know, and in favor of maybe using a gummy or an edible, right? And that, I would say, is a harm reduction. That's a beautiful example of harm reduction, because if you're still going out to use, and again, I want to emphasize, I work in populations that are already users. I'm not in the prevention space, right? So I'm not in looking at children and trying to prevent substance use. I'm in a substance use using environment. So how can we communicate elements of harm reduction so that people are making educated decisions about their use that therefore puts them at less risk for harms? So also an example is like how you use cannabis, right? So using concentrates it's a higher potency product, and therefore that's a higher risk relative to then smoking dry flower versus also then using edibles. And so, drinking and smoking is not a good idea either. I want to make that very clear, right? So I wouldn't say using cannabis and driving is a harm reduction tactic. No. Don't use any substances and drive. But yes, there are definitely benefits to cannabis use over and above other substances. It does provide short-term relaxation. It can help with sleep. It can help with some symptoms of PTSD. So there's lots of potential encouraging areas with cannabis. It's just we really need to be clear on the science, and the challenge is, of course, when you communicate that, then somebody's going to go out and get like a 90% THC concentrate and say, oh, this is going to help me sleep. No, friend, that is going to make you high and paranoid, right? So it can be muddy, but yes, it for sure, seeing a substitution of cannabis from alcohol, I think, can have some positives. Caveat: there are some people with higher risk profiles with cannabis, for example, with higher risk to things like schizophrenia and psychosis. So we need to be mindful of that as well.
Really, really insightful or helpful response there. I agree that oftentimes there is this sort of immediate black or white thinking of either, it is 100% good all of the time or absolutely terrible all the time. And there seems to be so much nuance between how you're using cannabis or how you're using different substances and what healthy or not healthy, but different behavior can have for your health outcomes, which leads me into my next question, which is about this relationship between faculty and even senior HQP. How can we, as faculty, staff, peers, how do we support students who are exhibiting those pink flags or are perhaps struggling with substance use, whether that's cannabis, alcohol, or any kind of substance use?
For sure. And yes, as you say, the first step is educating on pink flags. So for somebody that might be a graduate student, what that might look like is they are showing up repeatedly late or calling in sick a lot, because excessive substance use can affect our sleep, and it can affect our ability to get out of bed in the morning. So particularly if there's early morning meetings, somebody who's just repeatedly not showing up on time. Again, that's not explainable to other factors that they may have disclosed, for example, ADHD. And then, sort of erratic behaviors. So when they're good, they're great, and then they just fall off the map for a while. Again, that could be other things. But then also knowing how to have that conversation, right? Which is it's really uncomfortable with some people. And I want to emphasize is that if that doesn't feel comfortable for you, you don't have to have it. But maybe there's somebody else in your group who is maybe having an open conversation in a lab group meeting about substance use, so that it doesn't have to be a one-on-one with somebody, and just say like, hey, I want to acknowledge that sometimes when we get together at conferences, people, we all drink a lot. Like, how do we feel about that? How do you feel showing up hungover on your poster session? I'm a big fan of like honest, authentic, non-judgmental, stigma-free conversations. You can, if you are comfortable with talking one-on-one, you can use what are called motivational interviewing techniques. And there's lots, I'm happy to send you some resources afterwards that are freely available online that are put out through the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. We also have something posted on one of our Instagram campaigns called a check-in checklist, where we encourage people who use cannabis regularly is just every once in a while check in with yourself, check in like how am I feeling? Well, how's my relationship with substances? But back to that conversation or how to help somebody, if you feel comfortable approaching them and just saying like, I've noticed, right? I've noticed that you talk a lot about cannabis, and I noticed that when we go out, you're using a lot. You drink more than everybody else, or I noticed you are drinking a lot. Talk to me about it. How do you feel about that relationship? So it's curiosity, not judgmental, and shift from fixing the behavior to understanding the function. Ask them, what role is that substance playing in your life? Are you using a lot of cannabis because it's helping you sleep? Are you using it because it's helping you with your anxiety? Are there other things or supports or resources that we could turn to that, again, I'm not here to say stop using, but maybe to like gradually move in a different direction to help you with XYZ, because that's the trap sometimes, is that we're using it as an initial like, oh, I actually had a really good night's sleep, to then it's like every night, to then like maybe I'll use it a little bit like at 6 o'clock now because I am enjoying that relaxation. So it becomes a slippery slope. Nobody develops an addiction overnight. But it's being mindful of the impact on your mood and your other behaviors. And sometimes that takes somebody looking from the outside looking in. It's very hard to reflect on ourselves that we're not doing so well. And then the last thing I would say is, again, refer. So at Carleton, we have a process: respond, refer, report. Because again, as a professor, we don't have the skills, the tools, the creds to do substance use therapy. It's just, I would say it's about uncommon on us just to notice something, have a curiosity-based conversation, and end with, can I support you by sending you XYZ? And then I would encourage people to stay in the relationship, even if the behavior doesn't change immediately, because that does take time. So I'm all about showing that you will support somebody, regardless of what's going on with their mental health. And so that way you've built, like, it's like putting money into a bank account. You've built up the bank account enough so that they can start to take withdrawals, and they feel comfortable taking withdrawals in the form of, I need to take some time away, I'm not doing well. And to be able to feel comfortable with somebody to say that says that you've created that climate of comfort.
Really, really quite insightful. And I look forward to some of those documents. I'm sure that the C2M will be able to attach it, and we'll be able to send it to folks if they're interested. But yeah, modeling or understanding what is happening, approaching from a not a shame-based approach, and maintaining that relationship afterwards sounds like a really useful framework. I know in a lot of other environments, we as faculty or more senior graduate students or postdocs, we have to try and assist our peers, our more junior members. And one of the ways that typically happens is by modeling their relationships, whether that is with how we deal with conference anxiety, or how we go through our lab, or how we resolve conflict. So I was curious, is there specific things that we should be doing as more senior members to model healthier relationships with substances? Not necessarily to say that there are things that we should be doing 100% of the time or 0% of the time, but are there ways that we could emulate this behavior and help people, see it as a good thing?
For sure. Yeah. I love that question, because I think it's so important that, like we talked about with the mirror neurons, everybody's watching us, right? And students are always watching what we normalize, especially when we're not explicitly teaching. So what are we normalizing? Even if we're normalizing having a drink together at Mike's Place at the end of the day. They have some great non-alcoholic drinks, right? For
Mhm.
I'm always conscientious of our Muslim student populations who don't drink and shouldn't be in bars, right? So organizing events that don't center around substance use is really important. Making sure at conferences, if you're taking your students out, or if you're if you're out somewhere, making sure that it isn't centered around drinking or alcohol in some way or nature, some way or form. Being transparent without oversharing, that's a really difficult, like that's what we do as mentors, right? We don't quite become their friends, and we don't like keep them at a distance too. We are boundaried, but friendly, and we share within reason. And even like reflecting, like I can always say, like I will often reflect on my own relationship with alcohol with my students. Sometimes I'm like, I feel like I've been drinking too much a little bit lately. Maybe I'm gonna go for a non-alcoholic drink tonight. Like just even saying that neutral, like just acknowledging something that's going on with you, or saying what you're reflecting out loud, so people can also hear that and mimic it and model it. So, and finally, last thing I would say, don't glorify overwork and
That
substance
is quite hard
as
in
a coping
academia.
strategy to that, right? Like I would just encourage everybody after today, think about how often the images we see in ads and media, what people say, things that are sold in the stores about alcohol, and how normalized it is. Drunk mommies, like, I just need a drink to take care of my kid, ha 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 ha, memes, right? We don't necessarily have that with cannabis. Imagine if they'd had that with heroin or cocaine. How does our society normalize the behaviors, right? And it's just something to be mindful of. And what can you do to kind of push against that a little bit? Normalize wellness, normalize health, normalize open conversations.
Normalize thoughtfulness, normalize reflection.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a really big takeaway from this.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. I do have a very quick question, which is not directly related to cannabis use, but related to you as an academic. What advice would you want to give to a younger version of yourself, say in graduate school? What is a piece of advice that you think would be quite helpful for you to hear?
That those moments of struggle made you the strong person you are today. They shaped that it felt really hard at the time, but someday you will feel grateful that you can look at other moments of struggle and say, I got through that, therefore I can get through whatever this is going on today.
Very succinct, very well thought.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, or maybe wanted to know your thoughts. I'm an exchange student here, so I'm from Germany, and I worked with researchers at a water treatment plant there, and they told me that they see the concentration of beta blockers or their metabolites in the water from the university go up when exam season starts. I was wondering if you maybe like know of this trend, or like if that's something that's also happening here, or why that might be happening. Because what they told me was like, it's a very accessible drug to get from like elderly people who use beta blockers for heart disease or something, but it's also calming people, I guess, and like making them be able to study more, maybe. I don't know. That's just what I heard from them, and I thought that was very interesting and kind of shocking to me, to be honest. Also, activate my camera so you know who you're talking to. Hi.
Hi.
That was just a question I had. Maybe your opinion on that, and how also maybe how we could battle this, if it's like courses that every first year has to take or something like that, maybe talking about that more, because I was fully not aware of that happening, and I was kind of shocked.
That is shocking. It makes sense, as you said. So beta blockers like propranolol what they do, they're actually prescribed for people who have stage fright because it blocks the beta receptors of your heart. And it ultimately, it prevents that sort of like, you imagine you walk out in front of a moving bus, that sort of sense of your heart starts to race and like you get kind of sweaty. And people get that when they experience stage fright. So, or people are like playing concerts, and you can get prescribed propranolol because it actually doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It stays local, and it will actually reduce all that autonomic signal, so you feel calm. So when you feel like super stressed, there's a big brain-body connection, and that will further drive your stress. So the idea is that if you're not feeling the stress peripherally, then your brain will be better able to sort of calm down and be lower on anxiety. But that's fascinating to think that students, I'm guessing it's students, are somehow capitalizing on this and the awareness of that and are using it to help them with exams. What I thought you were going to say to me was the overuse of stimulants, because we also know that there are a fair number of students on campus that are prescribed stimulants for ADHD, that if somebody who does not have ADHD uses something like that, it actually will help them stay alert, study longer, etc. But it's the same idea. And I think, like you said, how to combat it, because these things don't come without risk, right? Is education and awareness campaigns, and making sure you're including people. I would say nothing about us without us. Don't have an education campaign targeting students when you don't have students involved in what that messaging would look like and the shape of that conversation. But wow, fascinating. Thank you for sharing.
I was thinking the same thing. When I heard that, I was like, it makes sense for me, but it's kind of crazy to think about what students have access to and what length they go to like battle the workload, because like they wouldn't do it if they didn't feel like they had to, right? So yeah, but that's very interesting. I didn't know like exactly how that works. So thanks for explaining.
Well, I love all this.
I just heard that. I was like,
wastewater surveillance stuff. Like I've been wanting to do, I think Canada is just starting wastewater surveillance within certain municipalities. You have to like opt into it to look at the like metabolites of, in particular, like very high risk substances that are at risk for overdose. But I would love to do it at at the institutions to see if the wastewater data mapped onto what students were telling us that they're using. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because if they're saying we're not using cocaine, but then you're seeing cocaine derivatives in the wastewater.
I know that wastewater was used quite regularly during COVID to map and understand when we were getting very large spikes, or perhaps even where in the city we might be seeing them.
Also, that was very possible in that specific water treatment plant because it's a research water treatment plant. So they only get the water from the university and the residencies and everything there, and a very small town beside. So they could pretty easily like say this is predominantly students. So that was very interesting.
I love science. That's very cool.
It is quite cool. On the note of loving science, we have a tradition for all of our guests. And I did warn you about this one, so I hope that you're ready. What is your favorite atom or molecule, and why?
So, as a neuroscientist, there's so much that keeps the cells going. And I'm going to go with potassium.
Okay.
Because potassium, as you know, is K. My name starts with a K. And I actually use it when I teach about the action potential and the different ionic balance inside and outside the cell. So we have at rest, the inside of the cell is much more negative relative to the outside of the cell, which is held there because of the semi-permeable membrane. And then, of course, we have diffusion. And anyway, and then so we have all these negatively charged proteins inside the cell, but then we have potassium, which is positively charged. And potassium really wants out. So I say, Kim wants out. So that's my like mnemonic for teaching the students. So I kind of have a love of potassium. But then like I did want to say molybdenum because I just love saying Is it molybdenum? Am I pronouncing it correctly?
Molybdenum is how we tend to refer to it, but I've heard it called molybdenum if people want to,
Molybdenum.
molybdenum. We actually have a grad student in our group named Molly Alderman, who was working on a molybdenum project for quite a while. So Molly working on Molly was
That's amazing.
All right. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Kim. We really appreciate your
My pleasure.
presence, and thank you to everyone for coming and watching.
Thanks for listening in, everybody. Hope we learned some things today.